You know, with the exception of a few years in the George W. Bush administration, I'm not sure that regime change in the Middle East has ever really been a major policy objective for the United States. The major policy objective for the United States across many decades, Republican and Democratic administrations, is stability. Stability in the Middle East is important for the United States to protect that free flow of oil to global markets. Stability in the Middle East is important for the United States to protect its allies and partners like Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Stability in the Middle East is important for the United States to push back against the threat of terrorism or revisionist states like Iran. And so the United States typically prefers stability to change in the Middle East. Now, what happened in 2011 is that stability was no longer an option. The fall of two regimes in Tunisia and Egypt, the civil wars that erupted in other governments, in other states, in Syria and Yemen and Libya, this threw the Middle East into disorder. The old order that the United States had protected for half a century was gone. There was no status quo for the US to uphold. And so now that everyone in the region, friends of the US and enemies of the US, are fighting for dominance, the question for the United States is, what kind of new Middle Eastern order would it prefer? What kind of new Middle Eastern order would its partners prefer? And what are they capable of building together? That, I think, is what's making this period so challenging in American policy. When I look at the outcomes from the Arab uprisings, I see, yes, some violent, horrific outcomes, and I see some bright spots and possibilities. The fact that Tunisians were able to transition from a horrific police state, and I visited it when it was a horrific police state, to what is a flawed but functioning democracy is a tremendous improvement for the people of Tunisia, but it's also a symbol of possibility for the rest of the Arab world, that they don't simply face a choice between dictatorship and chaos or dictatorship and terrorism. There is another way. Okay, so I think Tunisia is important not because it's perfect, but because it's an alternative. When we look at the violence that erupted in Syria and Libya and Yemen, I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't the demand for change that created that violence. It wasn't the demand for change that broke those states and created civil wars. What did that was the choices of the leaders to respond to demands for change with violence against their own citizens. It's the leaders who broke faith by shooting at their protesters. It's the leaders who, by creating that violence, generated a market for other guys with guns to defend citizens from their own government. And that's what created the civil wars. So I think it's important to distinguish the demands for change, which were building all across the region for decades before the Arab Spring, and the violence that resulted from leaders' response. There are places in the region where public demands for change were met with significant reform. In Morocco, there were protests. There was a new constitution written in collaboration with civil society and put to a referendum. Yes, Morocco is still a monarchy. It is a constitutional monarchy. It has its flaws, but it is not in a civil war, and a lot of changes have been made to empower people. And I think that process can continue. So regime change is not the point here. The point is that citizens have expectations that governments have to meet. And in the years leading up to the Arab Spring, a lot of governments were failing to meet basic expectations. Healthcare, education, income inequality was rising. Corruption was a huge concern all across the region, still is in many places. These demands haven't gone away. So one way or another, governments are going to have to figure out how to respond.